Welcome back. We're talking about the economic cooperation between China and the European Union. The European Union is China's largest trading partner, and China is the EU's second largest. That's more than $1 billion every day. Still with us to discuss the China-EU economic relationship, Keyu Jin is a professor at the London School of Economics. Shada Islam is with the Friends of Europe, and Andrew Small is with the German Marshall Fund. Shada, let me start with you this time. Something that you mentioned at the beginning of the show, and that is China's request to the EU to grant it market economy status. The WTO agreement says that status should be granted by December 2016. That's next month, but that doesn't seem likely. The European Parliament has already voted against it. The EU has raised concerns with China. What are the European concerns? And to some extent, has this become politicized, over-politicized?
It's extremely politicized, extremely political. It relates to what we heard just earlier about European Union demands for reciprocity, equally open access to Chinese markets, equally open access to procurement in China. So it's all about reciprocity. The Europeans say, look, our markets are open, your exports, your investments are coming in. We need the same degree, level of access to your markets. So that's a very important issue. The other one is global steel oversupply. Now, the Chinese argue, I think rightly, that there was fiscal stimulus in 2008 and 2009 that led to steel production going up in China, and now price a global problem. Here in Brussels, we've seen people out in the streets, steel workers, steel plants are closing in many parts of Europe, including in the UK. So this has become extremely political. And on top of that, as you know, there's been this huge discussion, a cliffhanger about whether the Canadian free trade deal with the EU will go through. So it's all very political. Trade, globalization, investments, all of this is mixed into quite a poisonous anti-globalization narrative that is being developed here. So when China comes and rightly says market economy status under WTO rules should be given to us by December, the European Union initially said, yes, of course. But then it became very political, including in the European Parliament, as I said, demonstrations in the streets. So I think what we're moving towards now is a kind of a fudge, a political fudge, whereby China will be taken off the list of state-owned state-owned economies, if you like. So there will be no list anymore. But at the same time, the European Union will beef up its trade defense measures so that it'll be easier to impose anti-dumping fines, because this is all about Chinese allegations that China sells its goods on European markets at below cost prices. So I think it's going to be a fudge. I think China will probably not be very happy with it. But given the current anti-globalization narrative, explosive, poisonous narrative here in Europe, I don't think we can get beyond that for the moment.
Andrew, the Europeans can say to the Chinese, look, our markets are open to you. We expect the same from you as well. But there is nationalist sentiment that's sweeping across Europe right now, and that is accompanied by calls for protectionism, for trade protectionism. Will that affect that relationship in some way?
Well, I mean, first of all, you have this technical question, which is market economy status and the specific legal issues around what the EU is required to provide China on this count. The attempt at the moment, I think, is to try to separate out some of these political and broader economic questions from the technical process of how this proceeds at the WTO. I mean, the argument, if you go back to the people who negotiated this, China's WTO accession in the first place, was we will grant you market economy status in the fullness of time at the end of this year, but we expect that over that period of time you will have evolved into something that resembles a market economy. And I think a lot of the negotiators on the Chinese side fully expected that China would look something more like a market economy by this juncture. So you now have this collision between the legal requirement probably to move on this shift of status that will reduce the European capacity to extend trade protection measures in various of these extremely sensitive sectors at the moment, because even more sensitive than it would have been a few years ago because of the overcapacity issue, and then this broader issue that Shada is talking about, which is trade at the moment is substantially more sensitive in general, not just specifically with China, China, and this means that even with close partners, even with traditional partners like the United States, where TTIP is a particularly toxic issue at the moment as well in Europe, the Canadian deal, it means that across the board there are pressures in Europe to behave differently and recalibrate their approach on trade. So China is seeing some of the negative repercussions of that, but then there are some very China-specific factors that are in play with market economy status and with the overcapacity issue.
All right, Keyu, we are rapidly running out of time, but I have to get this issue in, and that is Brexit. How will the loss of the EU's second largest economy impact EU-China relations?
Well, I know that we're short on time, but just one thing about the previous discussion, which I think is important, is that we need to put this all in context, which is how important is the steel industry per se. I can think about a few different other countries, a few different industries that have the same problem. However, what we know from research is that when economies are doing badly, that is when anti-dumping activities, protectionism, especially against China, heightens the most. So I think all of this discussion needs to be put in the context of particular global economic problems as a whole, not as independent sources of problems in and of themselves. And also in terms of market economy status, we are also calling out, this is also by the IMF and a lot of governments, for more intervention by the government, including capital controls, including macroprudential policies. The state intervention is actually warranted. So I find it very ironic and also very interesting that China in particular is put out in the center of debate while all the rest of the world is doing something else. But on Brexit, which is a topic that I cannot avoid at any point in day here, but I think that there is an opportunity in terms of fostering relationship between UK and China. From what I understand and what I believe is that this act itself has not hampered the relationship between China and the UK, and potentially is an opportunity for greater cooperation. But I do think that the financial services industry, I am concerned about that, because if depending on how the negotiations go, if certain kind of negotiations fail, for instance, the settlement of euros in London, then I can foresee many financial companies moving out of London, and that would be quite disastrous.